At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George pressed his eye against a scope that every man in his unit had mocked for 6 straight weeks. He was 27 years old. Illinois state shooting champion. 0 confirmed kills. Through that laugh-tat scope, he watched a banyan tree 240 yards away, and somewhere, in its branches hid a man who wanted him dead. The Japanese had 11 snipers working the Point Cruz groves. In the past 72 hours, those snipers had killed 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. The other officers called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he first unpacked that Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the company armorer had stared at it and asked if George planned to hunt deer or Germans. George told him it was for the Japanese. Then the regiment shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the entire voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their M1 Garands while his own weapon sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He filed paperwork, he made requests, he waited. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle George had saved 2 full years of National Guard pay to purchase. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The standard M1 Garand issued to every other man in his battalion weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds maximum. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon like everyone else. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. Those Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had held it against everything the Japanese threw at them, but they had not taken Mount Austin. And they had not cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese had fortified it with 500 men in 47 bunkers. They called it the Gifu. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 straight days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd. By then, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was different from Mount Austin. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese soldiers who had retreated west from Henderson Field and dug themselves into the massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They carried scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle better than any American. They knew how to wait. They knew how to kill. On January 19th, a Japanese sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol. On January 21st, 3 more Americans died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had already walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot back. He needed to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards in 1939. He had been 23 years old at the time. Youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could put 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave George until morning to prove it mattered. If you want to see how George's civilian hunting rifle performed against Japanese snipers trained specifically for jungle warfare, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories exactly like this one. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to George. George spent that entire night checking his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again. He checked every scope mount. He loaded 5 rounds of .306 hunting ammunition he had personally packed back in Tennessee. Same cartridge the Garand fired, military ball ammunition. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reported that Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that area. Banyan trees, some of them reached 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one of those trees before dawn and sit there all day without anyone on the ground seeing him. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began watching the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification, not much by modern standards, but enough to see movement in the branches that the naked eye would miss completely. The jungle was never truly silent. Birds called, insects buzzed, artillery rumbled in the distance. George had learned to filter out the constant noise and focus entirely on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom, methodical, patient. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved. There was no wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George kept watching. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man, dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies all week. George adjusted his scope to clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man who was trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked hard into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle like a whip. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked violently and fell. He dropped through the branches. His body tumbled 90 feet and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree with a sound George could not hear but somehow felt. George worked the bolt, the empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He kept his scope trained on that tree. He waited for movement. Nothing came. But George knew the truth. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. One shooter, one spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere close. Maybe in that same tree, maybe in the trees nearby. George began scanning the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created shadows that made shapes impossible to distinguish without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard George's shot. He knew his position was compromised. He was trying to escape. George aimed. He led the movement slightly. He fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both rifle and body hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry. Except at Camp Perry, the targets never shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt directly into his face. George rolled left immediately and pressed himself flat against the bunker wall. His heart hammered. The shot had come from the southwest. Different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking that shot. That was basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate immediately. But in jungle this dense, relocation options were severely limited. The sniper could not have gone far. George found him at 11:38, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but he had remained in the same tree. A mistake, a fatal mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark ship and fired. The third sniper fell without making a single sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion faster than fire. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused every request. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted quickly after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight hours. George spent the entire afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing but shadows and leaves. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting for him. The mockery was completely gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for him to work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement completely. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday, also smart. They were learning his capabilities. They were adapting. George compensated for the increased distance and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth kill brought a response George had not anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortar began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George understood what was happening. The third salvo would hit the bunker directly. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove headfirst into a shell crater as the third mortar salvo obliterated the bunker he had occupied just moments before. The explosions threw debris high into the air. George relocated to a different position. A fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided decent cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them now. They were hunting him back. The dynamic had completely changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel to the death. At 14:23, George killed his seventh sniper. At 15:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree, good concealment. But the height created a silhouette against the sky. When the sun angle changed, George saw it. George shot it. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 straight hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would be the best. The ones who had survived the longest, the smartest, the most experienced. And now they knew exactly what George looked like. They knew exactly what rifle he carried. They knew his tactics. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap, staring at nothing. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position. A cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. George settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved slowly. George began glassing trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only 40 feet up, unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sightlines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be completely invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level, he was elevated on the rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head clearly. George aimed, he controlled his breathing. He began to squeeze the trigger, then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days straight. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them this easily. Not unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash. Ready to return fire the instant George revealed himself. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of that palm. It took 11 full minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm. 91 feet up, the Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from three sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there, or waiting for George to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. Either way, the Japanese sniper was watching the wrong location. George had two problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong spot. If George fired at him now, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree. He would begin searching for him, and George would lose his advantage completely. George made his decision. He would use their bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree. He adjusted for wind. He fired. The decoy sniper jerked violently and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift in the shadows. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark ship and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills, but George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned just 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving even slightly. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into that crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics now. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location, and somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning his counterattack. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible, but not always identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch, or it could be a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees, he was on the ground. And he was moving directly toward George's position. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling methodically toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained absolutely motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him completely. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks carefully, searching for movement. Searching for any sign of his target, George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work. The ability to remain perfectly still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards, 25 yards, he was approaching from the south side. The same side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic immediately. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the exact same way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was completely exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers. Men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy, another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but he expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it. Somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning. Just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision quickly. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen absolutely nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently. Water dripped from the barrel. From his uniform, from his face, he brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks. Now 42 yards away, George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze completely. Voices, Japanese voices, coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers. But the snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the crater immediately. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking. Equipment rattling. These were not snipers. These were infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds in his head. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater. Close enough that he could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line. Toward George's crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful enough about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester. 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options quickly. Stay hidden and hope they passed by, or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down, directly at George. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side. Away from the approaching voices, he ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater. Around the fallen tree, the soldiers were firing at movement. At sound, not at confirmed targets, George stayed low. He glassed the area through his scope, saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left in the rifle. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group approaching from the south. Another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision instantly. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. Now, George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots, branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past his head, struck trees, kicked up dirt around his feet. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened hard. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet now, no voices, no movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him sharply. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief immediately. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over for days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits, then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills. 5 total rounds fired in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 solid hours cleaning every single component. Cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they came out perfectly clean. He checked the scope mounts. Adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George immediately. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure. Operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had just done? George said he could try. But it would require time, and rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request without hesitation. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes went to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. But none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals. breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the inertial scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards. Then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams. Shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry, stragglers who had not yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 missed due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative, only confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tenamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down hard. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover fully, but he needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star, but George's war was not finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George did not know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove very useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5,307th Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but the men had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics. Jungle survival. Operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits. Small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as sniper. The Army did not have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse. Steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force ever could. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks. Hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February of 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the M1 Garand airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support. Just rifles and mortar and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 90 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive. Different from the Garand's sharp crack, one shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to M1 Garand took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 3,000 men was down to fewer than 1,300 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured M1 Garand airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less. Firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle. Perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made, but modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics. But there would be no next war for George, not immediately. By June of 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July of 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements. Probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing, mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial skill. But something was being lost: the individual skill. The craftsman approach to soldiering. The idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January of 1947, Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the G. Bill. He studied politics. Graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he had served in the Pacific. But they did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about the Japanese snipers. They did not know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh in his mind. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical. Detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics. Not the kind of content that interested general readers, but the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship, just facts and observations about what worked and what did not work in combat. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about riflemen who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.